Very good. Earth Day. And Earth Day is celebrated all around the world for different reasons, by different people. And here in our European calendar, it's celebrated this year on the 22nd of the year 2022. And so glad to be with you. I got a short time to bring us together in the spirit. And as I'm doing that, I will talk to you about what I'm doing. I'll start out with the Cherokee calling song, which is what people communicated as they were traveling toward another tribe's area. Way away, hey, hey, away, away, way away, way away, hey, 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 away, hey, 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 away, hey. And that would have been repeated 4 times at least. And if there were more than one group of people coming to greet the group that lived there, they would sing it 4 times for each group. I wanted to bring you into a sacred space, just as many Native people come to sacred space. So this is to represent the fire that's on the table here. And the fire, for instance, in the Cherokee people, was their life. That was the way that they went about their daily lives. They kept a fire going all the time, summer, winter, spring, and fall. And it was also the center of their circle when they had circle time for community, or when their council met. There was also a fire in the middle. I wanted to make sure that I honored all the things of the earth. I have a feather to honor those who are winged. I have this little rattle that we use as a talking stick to represent the animals all throughout the earth, whether they're swimming or walking. I had something to remind us of the world as we know it, of growing things, and a special blessing for you all from the water, which of course is the center of our beings. Now, a prayer usually is said toward the directions. So I'm going to start with the north. And the prayer for the north remembers that even cold is to help us to survive. In the east, we are reminded that all things are sacred because we derive our very beings from all life, and our way is set by the morning dawn. As we go around, we come to the south, and of course, warm breezes and storms and many other things come from the south, and it is red, and we appreciate the south no matter whether it's destructive or not. We go to the west to also recognize that there is good in the dark as the sun sets, and as we bring ourselves to a time of sleep. The Cherokee have not just 4, but 7 places. They also recognize the upward, which they burn tobacco to recognize all of the things in the earth that can go through the air. And we recognize the down, which is, of course, below the earth and everything that's helpful, and within ourselves. So be blessed on this Earth Day, and please begin to pray for our organization as we come to this new place.
My name is Rick Lowry. I am the president of the Disciples of Christ Historical Society. And I am very pleased to welcome members of the Center for Indigenous Ministries to the Disciples of Christ Historical Society in Bethany, West Virginia. We are gathered here on land that once was camping ground for the Shawnee and Mingo peoples. This land later became the farmstead of Alexander Campbell, an Irish immigrant who came to this land from an island that was racked by religious violence that was itself the result of a long history of imperial forced relocations of indigenous populations by imperial powers. As the religious movement that emerged from the Campbells' teachings and that of others began to move west, it often did so without much thought about the peoples being displaced. It's time to tell the full story. And Disciples of Christ Historical Society is greatly honored that you have chosen to come to our home to begin the process of telling the truth and coming to terms with it.
Thank you, Rick, for that welcome. I'm the Reverend Dr. Lori Pound-Fell. I serve on the advisory committee for the Center for Indigenous Ministries. I'm also the pastor of First Christian Church in Minneapolis. I'm the founder and co-facilitator of Disciples Public Presence, and I serve as the co-facilitator for our Disciples Justice Ministries. I have the honor and privilege of just sort of leading us through today. You will be hearing from other members of our ministry. You'll be hearing from Reverend Dr. Lisa Barnett and Crow Eddie. Crow is in Nova Scotia. They are the co-chairs for the Center for Indigenous Ministries. You will also be hearing from Reverend David Bell, who is the minister for Center for Indigenous Ministries, as well as Reverend Leslie Dotson, who serves along with me and everyone I've mentioned on the Center for Indigenous Ministries. We are grateful that you have joined us today. We have important things that we are going to be sharing with you, so I hope that you will listen carefully. But I want to tell you a little bit about who we are. We come out of and are located in the history of the Yakima Reservation, which included the Yakima Christian Mission, Yakima Indian Christian Mission, and the American Teepee Christian Mission. The Center for Indigenous Ministries, though, we grew out of the work on the General Assembly Resolution 1324, which called the church to reflect on the Christian theology and polity, the Christian doctrine of discovery, and the indigenous voice within the Christian Church Disciple of Christ. And that resolution passed. And then we presented another resolution, Resolution 1722, which called for the repudiation of the Christian doctrine of discovery, a call to education and action and support for indigenous voices in the witness of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. That resolution also passed. So we envision the Center for Indigenous Ministries to be a recognized ministry of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, where Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples gather to support, promote, and advocate for Indigenous justice in nation states of Canada, the United States, and in other global communities. So welcome into this space here at the Historical Society, and we welcome you into the space of the Center for Indigenous Ministries. We will now hear from our two co-chairs, Reverend Dr. Lisa Barnett and Crow Eddie.
Thank you, Lori. Most attempts to engage in truth and healing work fail. The South African 1995 The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is probably the most successful of listening to the truth of killing, sorrow, and torture and responding with, to an extent, reparative work that may lead to reconciliation. Others, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and Maine's Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission, have done well listening to truth stories, but have limited success in responding with action that might lead to reconciliation. In most all cases, the truth work is applauded and owned as good work by governments and institutions. However, the hard work of action and reparation are lost when cameras are turned off and the media goes away. For hard work means systemic and institutional change, of which neither sometimes wants. The Center for Indigenous Ministries recognizes the difficulty of engaging action that might lead to reconciliation. Governmental and institutional failure to engage in meaningful work of reconciliation after truth-telling has occurred because the line between truth and reconciliation is not straight. Rather, the work between truth and reconciliation is messy, full of challenges, and requires at least the periods of work and action, which is why we are proposing initial steps to begin to take action. And this is especially important for disciples, as our own denominational history is fraught with both problems and neglect in the recognition of indigeneity within our midst. Hearing the stories to learn the truth is important. Just a few weeks ago, at the Historical Society's Kirkpatrick Conference on Racism, a few intersections of disciples and American Indians were identified, including two that were related to Alexander Campbell and Bethany, where our hosts are sponsoring this event today. I lift up the second of those that was highlighted at the conference from 1852 to 1861, where they wrote, Alexander Campbell brought a young man of the Iowa tribe to Bethany to be educated, and he was with the Campbell family for 8 or 9 years. Actually, there is more to this story. This young man had a name. His name was Harvey William Campbell. This is a Christian Century from January 1892 that talks about Campbell in the past. What of him? Who is he? He was one of the Indian boys that Brother Alexander Campbell picked up on one of his trips west. He is an Iowa Indian. Brother Campbell took him to Bethany and gave him an education. Well, what became of Brother Harvey? After leaving Bethany, he returned to his Western home and his own people as a Christian. Well, what I have discovered about Brother Harvey is that he was actually born in Missouri in 1843. He was half native Iowa. It was actually his father, Vance Murray Campbell. So he's not named for Alexander Campbell. His father was an American fur trader and U.S. treaty interpreter who originally came from Virginia and married Eliza Whitecloud, who was the daughter of one of the chiefs of the Iowas, No Heart, Nottichimini. And so Harvey William Campbell himself comes from some of the leadership of the Iowa tribe. He did go to Bethany with Campbell and then left there in 1861 to serve in the Civil War. He served Company G from the 1st Nebraska Infantry fighting for the Union. He achieved the rank of sergeant and served until the summer of 1866, after which he went to Omaha, Nebraska, and he married Clara Barta in 1866, and they had 4 children. So this young man that we talk about of Alexander Campbell getting and bringing actually has a name, Harvey William Campbell of the Iowa tribe. I actually first discovered his name from reading in Reminiscences of Alexander Campbell, written by his second wife, Selina Campbell, published in 1882. And allow me to share from page 467 of that entry, where she has a letter from Alexander Campbell. I and your mother desire that Harvey will commit some new chapters to memory, and you will attend meeting with all propriety. And then she follows up saying, the boy Harvey was an Indian lad, some 9 years old. When Mr. Campbell had his agent, D.C. Roberts of Illinois, traveling for the Harbinger and also Bethany College, he got the boy for Mr. C, being instructed by him to get a healthy lad, as he wished to educate one of the sons of the red man. Mr. C thought they had been unkindly treated and felt a strong desire to have one under his own training. So Harvey was brought into our family and cared for with attention and kindness. He was one of the Iowa tribe and was obtained from an uncle of his by paying a sum of money for him. He was bright and lived with us some 9 or 10 years. Mr. C sent him to school and wished him to have him educated at Bethany College, but he wished to return and see his friends and brothers and sister. It was Mr. C's desire to teach him the Christian religion and have him influenced by it that he could return and preach to his brother Indians. The end of her words. My friends, that attitude, though prevalent from 1882, is still one that led disciples in a desire to create a boarding school in the early 20th century that ultimately resulted in the Yakima Christian mission. And this is some of the truth that we are beginning to learn, and some of the truth that we need to work for in terms of reconciliation. And so now I would like to turn it over to my friend Crow to continue this conversation.
Kwe. Hello, everybody. My name's Crow. I'm part of the Mi'kmaq Nation here in what we call Mi'kma'ki, but I'm in Nova Scotia. Mi'kma'ki would include also PEI, Newfoundland, parts of the eastern US. Interesting thing about Nova Scotia, I'm not that familiar with the situation in the US, but in Canada, we're one of the few places that has is unceded territory. We never signed a treaty to give up our lands to the British at that time. It's left us with a very interesting situation here. We do have many treaties of peace with the people that come here. This has created a situation where we call ourselves treaty people. And I don't just mean myself as a Mi'kmaq, but also the non-Mi'kmaq members here in Nova Scotia. We're all treaty people. So it's an interesting start to seeing how we can build a relationship together, just like this project we're working on. Part of our project will be going out into communities and with different nations and collecting stories, collecting people's stories. Some of you may be familiar with stories of residential schools, stories of mass unmarked graves of children. And there's so many more personal stories, so many levels to these stories. Here in Nova Scotia, I run a healing circle at Milton Christian Church. And basically what a healing circle is about is listening to people's stories. I will pass the eagle feather around the circle. And as I tell anyone there participating, when you have the eagle feather, you're allowed to speak. For everyone that doesn't have the eagle feather, they have the more important task of listening. And as we go around and collect the stories, the healing begins. The healing begins for the people who are telling the stories. The healing also will begin for anyone listening to the stories. It's the listening that's so important, and to build that connection between the native population and the non-native population. I'd like to share with you a story. I was asked to give a talk on my healing circle to a group of disciple members that were non-native. And at the end of this talk, we had a dinner too. So some of the men were doing dishes and the rest of us were still just sitting in a circle, just kind of chatting. And one of the members of the church, a really fine man and a good Christian and a good member of the disciples, started to tell me a story. Did I mention he was non-native? It's kind of important to the story. He told me a story about when he was younger and he was in Northern Ontario with his wife in a remote community working as a teacher. And this community being so remote, you would be on the train, you would let the train know they need to stop in the middle of nowhere, and you would just go down a path to where this community was. I asked him, so you're teaching in this community, who were you teaching? And he said, mostly native peoples living in this community. So interesting, I'm still listening. But as he's telling me this story, he relates that there was a boy and his name was, or they called him Walter. And the nurse who visits 3 times a year, whatever, comes in and she's looking for Alexander. And he said, well, we don't have an Alexander here. Turns out that Alexander was Walter. Well, it's a kind of an innocuous story, isn't it? He also mentioned that the native children would be picked up, taken away to another school, residential school, and returned at Christmas time. And a lot of those students wouldn't return back to school after Christmas, he mentioned. I walked away from this and knowing this man very well, and he's a very kind man. So I didn't want to fault him for this, but I walked away as a Native person thinking, man, that was a very racist story that I just heard. And being a story, like all stories, we need to think about them. And if they really touch our hearts, like that one did with me, I really need to think about it. And it's interesting, the things we don't think about, the things that we overlook. The fact that in Native communities, people were going in to teach them or taking the children to residential schools to teach them. These children had names. What were their names? Why was it so difficult to learn Walter's real name? Why was the nurse giving him a name? Why was the school giving him a name? It really should percolate in our minds what we need to think about, what has really gone on, and the arrogance of trying to transform somebody from who they are to who you want them to be. I can imagine in any relationship, if we did that with our spouses, it would be a nightmare. Also, when he started to talk about the children not returning to school and knowing a lot about the cruelty and what went on in residential schools, it made me think. Of course, I was aware of this cruelty, but I became aware of something else. I became aware of, okay, these children live in a remote community. There's no village, there's no town, there's a Native community there and some non-natives there involved in trapping. And so what was the use of this education? Why did we feel that this education was important? I'm gonna, as a member of that community, I'm gonna go back and still trap, still make moccasins, still do the things I already know how to do to survive. I can imagine these children's thoughts of how useless this information is to their lives. When later on in time, when you have Native communities living alongside non-Native communities, I think children become more aware of what they need the education for. But in this situation, did they even need the education? And as we know, residential schools weren't really set up for the education. They were set up to take the native out of the children, cut their hairs, ban them from speaking their languages. So this story that I was told led me to go much further in my own mind, let me to think a lot deeper on all the different aspects of this story. And like the stories we will be collecting, it will not only allow people to heal through telling their stories, but it will allow everyone else that's listening to heal. And thank you for listening to me.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Reverend Leslie Dotson. I serve the Bloomfield Christian Church in Bloomfield, Iowa. I have been asked to share with you today stories that we call reparations. For you see, reparations work must be done to prepare mindsets and institutional governance for change. Once reparative work is well along in changing minds, but before completed, second, institutional reparations begin. Reparations are substantial institutional changes in governance, restitution, and finances. When reparative work and reparations have occurred for some time, then the work of restoration begins. Restorative work brings about right relationship to what once was natural and created. After years, if not generations, of reparative work, reparations and restorative reconciliation can start. An easy definition of reparations is a repairing or keeping in repair, the act of making amends, offering expiation, and or giving satisfaction for a wrong. These actions will move us towards reconciliation. Throughout the United States and our sister Canada, we can move together to get started and then continue with our reparations. Just take a look at our seminaries and colleges. TCU has a page on their website for Native American Indigenous Peoples Ministries. Take a look at that wonderful page. These actions can begin at this very moment. These are actions everybody can begin in order to become part of our total ministries. That includes Indigenous Ministries. Reparative work leads to reparations. However, only self-arrogance of this generation would leave reparations for tomorrow. Our ancestors, the cloud of witnesses, have long engaged reparative work. The voice of yesterday's kin haunt today's generation to recognize their reparative work and begin in active initiative reparations work. So I'd like for you to open your ears to hear some reparations that we'd like to share with you. The first one, United Christian Missionary Society for trustees and officers. 10% of annual endowment shall go to Indigenous Ministries. Currently, Yakima Christian Mission, YCM, and then to YCM successor organization. Current receivers of UCMS Giving Home Disciples Missions and Global Ministries shall publicly support the transfer of funds. General Board of the Christian Church shall present Center for Indigenous Ministries to the 2023 General Assembly for recognition as a recognized ministry. Disciples Home Mission Board and President, interim or permanent, shall work with CIM, Center for Indigenous Ministries, to have CIM become YCM's successor organizations. This work shall be completed by the 2023 spring equinox. Bethany College shall provide 10 full ride scholarships for Indigenous young adults. This is to be administered by the college, each scholarship requiring approval by the Center for Indigenous Ministries. Bethany College shall have funds and tenure an instructor or professor on Indigenous justice. Bushnell University shall continue to manage the 1929 Flint Endowment Fund with all monies going to Indigenous justice. Bethany College shall have fund and tenure an instructor, a professor on Indigenous ministries. Northern Lights region, in recognition of 100 years of Yakima boarding and church home work, shall redirect the monies of the Turner Lecture Endowment to be exclusively used for Indigenous justice work. This work shall be guided by Indigenous people or the Center of Indigenous Ministries. Thank you and blessings.
As Reverend Dotson has shared with us ways that we can do reparative work right now, I want to remind you that the Truth and Healing Councils will be meeting. Our plan is for the Truth and Healing Council to meet in every one of our regions to listen for the voices of our Indigenous siblings. We already are planning to be in the Tulsa location the week of September 22nd of this year to begin the first Truth and Healing Council. We are looking at doing a healing council in the Minneapolis, the Twin Cities area, in Albuquerque, and in Nova Scotia. You are in regions. Those of you that are watching, you are in regions. We encourage you to reach out and let us know when or where we could come in your region, and be aware that we are coming. We are also being invited not just by our churches, but by our Indigenous siblings that are in these different regions. We look forward to the report that comes from our Truth and Healing Council. We know that it's going to call us to further reparations and hard work. But we as a church, this is what we're called to do. We are that movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. Well, we can work to make this world not so fragmented and to do what is right by our Indigenous siblings. I'm now going to turn it over to Reverend Dave Bell.
Good day. It's wonderful to be with you today. I ask you that as we move towards a closing to join me in a prayer. The womb has asked us to become more, to imagine the unknown and consider a journey with little more than wonder and a nudge. We began to amble, our ancestors watched, our elders paid attention, and our children listened. They listened for wisdom rising from our listening and honor from our purpose. They hope we know brokenness when we see it and love in the healing of it. The womb of mountain crevices and desert canyons and ocean waves invites people to truth, to touch the wounds of creation, to loosen the feet, to lie down and to heal with a kiss. When our time is done and elders and children experience healing and the wholeness of peace, we will become one, reconciled with all, knowing the well-being of creation's womb once more. Amen. We'll now move to a time of questions and answers. If you have a question, we ask you to please put it in the chat. And between Lori and Leslie and Crow and Lisa, we will do our best to help answer whatever may be on your heart. And I believe Lori will help us cover those chats if you have any questions. So please join us. Ask away.
Dave, I'll go ahead and start with a question for you. When we talk about the Truth and Healing Council, how do you see that comprised? Who serves on that? I don't mean names, but what is the makeup of that council?
Right. As that council is developed, Lori, I believe that it will be of primarily Indigenous folks who are listening, who are there, but not alone. That both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people will be there, and disciples and non-disciples. That we see that this is critical work for disciples, but that this work of of healing. To move towards healing in one day at some time is all of our work. And the reality, to be honest about who we are as disciples, is that we've done it very little of it as a denomination. When we look to our siblings who are Episcopal and Methodist and Presbyterian and Quaker, we need the help of all. So in my imagination is the council will be primarily Indigenous people and with breadth both within and without disciples.
Okay, thank you. Lisa or Crow, do you have anything to add to that?
I want to say that one of the things too, in the collecting of the stories from Indigenous people to share, we are going to seek permission from them to have those stories recorded in some form or fashion and housed within the Historical Society as well as within the archival library here at Phillips Theological Seminary, that then those stories get circulated amongst the council to hear and prepare then a final report. But that preserving those stories is also an important part of this journey towards healing.
Thank you. All right. We have a question. Go ahead, Crow. I'm so sorry. Please go.
I was just going to say, when I think about the stories, I just think about the myriad of different stories people will be sharing with us of the complexity and the different levels of struggle and racism that they have faced.
Thank you, Crow. And my apologies again for cutting you off there.
No, it's okay.
We do have a question. What is the best first steps to take to get my region involved and on board with this ministry? Whichever one of y'all wants to answer.
A great first step would be to contact your regional minister and ask them if they're aware of what's going on and what they may be. But let me step back. A good first step is contact myself. Contact me, and I'll help you. I will help you move down that path to get your region involved in this ministry. And if I've got any problems with it, Lisa, Crow, and Lori will be happy to help me.
True. Yeah. Thank you for that question. We have another question. What is the relationship now between disciples and the Indigenous communities who have a history at the Yakima Christian School?
Right, and I'll start with that and let others follow up with me. The relationship within the Yakima Nation today is primarily myself and my family, and folks who have been interacting with the mission over the years. So the little bit from the outside comes from congregations from across the United States and Canada who send youth groups, often youth groups, sometimes elder groups, to come and to have conversations. But within the community itself, I'll say this, is that each year we are busy writing grants to bring money into the community to be used, often for the well-being and the work of children. So for instance, last year, within the community, we brought a grant in, and a tremendous amount of work was done around grief that came out of COVID and how that grief was unique to families within on the Yakima, within the boundaries of the Yakima Nation. So that's a little bit of what goes on locally.
Lisa, Crow, either one have anything you want to add to that?
No, Dave actually knows more about what is taking place within the denomination and specifically Yakima, since he is located there. So I defer to him.
Yeah, speaking outside of Yakima, just to the relationships part of the question, here in Nova Scotia, the disciples Christian churches have a very good relationship with the Native community. When I first moved to this specific community, there were a lot of Mi'kmaq already in attendance at the church, and it was quite a wonderful welcoming for me at the church.
All right, those of you that are watching, I can see your names, so I know who's on, and I know that you are very talkative people. So please feel free to type a question into the chat, and you can ask anything. And if we know the answer, we'll answer. And if we don't know the answer, of course, we'll tell you that we don't know the answer. But please ask. I know there must be many, especially after the reparations that Leslie mentioned. There's got to be some thoughts, some questions, something you want to know more about. Maybe a question about why isn't there already an Indigenous voice within disciples? That's a great question. I can answer it, but I'm wondering if one of either Dave, Lisa, or Crow would like to answer it.
Well, I typically say that a huge part of that, again, kind of goes back to some of that history, much like American history, that idea Crow had mentioned, assimilation, of stripping the indigeneity out of individuals and trying to turn them into the prototype white American, good citizen. And I think then a lot of that, the concerns of Indigenous people then got pushed under the rug. And that's why the seat at the table wasn't open for them, because they just kind of gotten forgotten over the years.
Right. And I would say, to follow up on Lisa, with what Lisa said, is that disciples are a congregational based denomination. And if you do not have congregations, you don't have voice. And disciples were historically not about raising up Indigenous congregations, but more about Christianizing and civilizing the people to become a part of the existing white congregations that were out there. And so because of that, there's not a base that rises up. So the structure itself holds Indigenous voice to the outside.
So there are two more. Oh, Terry, thank you very much. Terry Hord-Owen sent a message to the panelists. Thank you. It is wonderful to have our general minister and president watching today. So thank you so much. We have a two-part question. So listen to both parts. So is Yakima, I know I had to tell you all that, right? So is Yakima Christian Mission changing its name and perhaps its mission to the Center for Indigenous Ministries? And how is the Center for Indigenous Ministries funded? Is it funded sufficiently? Sustainability?
I'll start. again. And so is YCM changing its name? The Yakima Christian Mission is not changing its name. It's remaining the same as it is. However, the Center for Indigenous Ministries is asking Disciples Home Missions to have a conversation on changing, looking at the structure of Yakima Christian Mission and that whole piece and moving that towards something different than what it is today. Center for Indigenous Ministries is certainly about bringing voice to the denomination and asking the denomination to be accountable to that voice. And so Yakima Christian Mission has never been a part of that in that particular way. And so we're not so much looking for a name change, but as one of the reparations that was mentioned, is that we believe that Center for Indigenous Ministries should become the successor organization to Yakima Christian Mission. We should look at the 100 years of Yakima Christian Mission, look at that work of it, honor the people who have done that work, recognize what it is, but we're clear to say that it's time for that structure to move to another era after 100 years, and to raise up a clear voice, accountable Indigenous voice within the denomination.
And you address the funding in that?
Oh, well, Center for Indigenous Ministries funding is very, very light. Because specifically, we're looking to develop that type of structure. So right now, all funding, all natural funding that's within the denomination naturally go, if it goes anywhere, it goes to Yakima Christian Mission. But we should also recognize that that when we think of special funds that go out there, nothing like that goes to Yakima Christian Mission. All monies that go to Yakima Christian Mission today are individual or congregation donations that go in. But there's clearly no denominational money that is clearly going into any type of funding that's for Indigenous voice within a denomination. I hope, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but.
I think you did. I'm going to move on to the next question, Lisa and Crow, if that's okay with you two. How did you all figure out the percentage of the endowment to offer as a reparation? Why 10%? What about if an Indigenous student connected to DOC folks wants to attend a non-DOC university? Could there be scholarships for that broader use?
I'm not sure about the 10% and the funding mechanism, so I'm going to let Dave speak to that. But I personally think that scholarships for Indigenous folks who want to attend colleges wherever, whether they're DOC or not, should be allowed. There are some wonderful tribal run educational institutions that have a decolonizing educational approach that a lot of Indigenous students might want to take advantage of, and particularly a lot of colleges too that maybe offer Native American studies programs that are not offered at disciple colleges. So I would definitely be in support of scholarship opportunities for Indigenous DOC students to attend a non-DOC university or college, tribal or otherwise.
Right, and I agree with Lisa. I think that there's many places that folks can go. The 10%, I'm trying to remember that, but in my head, the only 10% I remember the reparation piece is United Christian Missionary Society and that endowment. And that number was a guess. So I could say that in my own opinion, it should be more in the 20 to 50%, because the American Christian Missionary Society and the United Christian Missionary Society, its successor organization, are the ones who are focused on bringing Christianity to Indigenous people, both at home and across the world. And so I think I personally think the number should be larger. However, I'm very well aware that endowment is being used by organizations who that's a part of their budget. And it's been a part of their budget for a long time. And so it's a significant hit on those organizations. So today, as a transition piece, I think that we feel that something in the realm of 10% is a reasonable number, recognizing that the institutions who are currently receiving those funds will clearly have to cut something. And we know that hurts. And that pains us as well, because we're not here to raise up hurt, but we also recognize that the hurt that's existing in the Indigenous world today is large, and to ask systems and certainly the institutions to be able to give up something so that we can raise Indigenous voice is critical for the disciple denomination today.
We have more questions. We may have more questions than we have time, but hopefully we can get to all of them. I first do want to read something that our general minister and president sent in the chat, which only the panelists and the host can see. Terry wants us to know that she states her full support for this ministry, and she looks forward to working with our full communion partners in the United Church of Canada, who have a wonderful legacy of working for reconciliation and justice for Indigenous peoples. So thank you very, very much. And I know that means a lot to Crow in there too. Not to speak for you, Crow, but what are some of the reparations, institutional changes within the disciples that are already in place or will be part of how we do ministry on ceded and unceded Indigenous lands in Canada, US, and other countries such as Puerto Rico and Congo?
I think that's a great question. And,
Yes.
and again, folks can follow up. What are some of the reparations currently going on within disciples? There aren't any, not that I know of. So if anybody's got any, let me know, because I would certainly hate to be out there telling stories. I think that's exactly what this is what we're talking about when truth and healing is to bring about healing, is to bring about a time of both reparative work, to have these conversations that help us understand what has happened in the past and what is going on now, so that reparations can happen. But as Leslie said, the Cloud of Witness has been doing this for a long time. And that's why there's certain things that can happen right now. That's why we say stuff like Bushnell University can, however they're using the Flynn Endowment today, should all go to Indigenous ministries, for we know that money. So we know, because we know that money was built on the backs of Yakima people who ceded some land and did not cede a tremendous amount of land. And so that work needs to go on. But currently, both in the United States, Canada, Hawaii, Alaska, our territories, if disciples are doing any reparative work, I don't know about it, but I would be it would be wonderful to hear if anybody is doing any.
It seems as if I heard about a church maybe in Arizona. So if somebody's on that can correct me. Oh, it has something to do with the land and the building and reparations. So I do believe there may be a congregation or two, but institutionally, I would say you're absolutely right, Dave. Crow or Lisa, any words to add?
Yeah, actually, Lori, I think that last part kind of sets then up kind of another question that's in the chat. What responsibility do congregations have in this important work? And I
Right.
think that's a huge piece of the puzzle as well, that it's not just this top down, you know, they have to absolve for all of this, because every single congregation that exists is existing on what was once indigenous lands that has been taken from indigenous communities by white settlers and incorporated then into that system of settler colonialism. And so I think a first step is for congregations to kind of come to that recognition and to understand that. And while feasibly, it may not be possible to give all of that land back, as you know, maybe one church is trying to do, at least the idea, though, of acknowledging the land and committing to doing social justice work for indigenous people on behalf of the land where your congregation sits. And doing something to help promote, I mean, between murdered and missing indigenous women, between water rights issues and environmental racism, between healthcare inequities, between, you know, the list goes on and on and on around sovereignty issues for Native communities. Churches can get involved in justice issues to work as allies for indigenous peoples.
I'd just like to add as an example to that, the Milton Christian Church has allowed me to continue. I think we're on about the 5th or 6th year now doing Native healing circles at the church. We're also, the church is also looking at purchasing some land suitable to build and have a sweat lodge available to the participants. So these are just examples of things that are justice work and really really easy to do, as I guess what I'm thinking. It's to reach out at that level, would be an easy way for congregations to start the ball rolling. Yeah.
Thank you, Crow.
Yeah, I want to add that following
go
up
ahead.
on that, I think that's where our Methodist brothers and sisters have done a better job with their reconciliation ministry, in that some local congregations, specifically like in Norman, Oklahoma, where there's, you know, a lot of OU indigenous students there, have set up specific sweat lodges or, you know, teepee structures for, you know, sacred spiritual practices to be done by indigenous students. And so those are some options that other congregations have available to them in different communities.
Great. I would love to get this one last question in, and then we would have answered everyone's questions. I know we've gone over a little, but I think it's worth it. This person has been attending the lay leadership education program by the region of Canada. And says our regional minister, Reverend Dr. Jen Garvin, has this week begun a 3-part session on disciples theology. I wonder if there is an intention or if efforts have been made to invite Indigenous ministries to inform disciples theology. It's a great question.
And specifically to Center for Indigenous Ministries, there has not been that type of request. However, and I think this is an important piece of reparative work, is that Center for Indigenous Ministries, as that Lori brought up, has been trying to do this work since 2013. And certainly the work was going on prior to that. But in that time, we did not do it ourselves, but we have folks like Lisa Barnett who are doing this work. The work is getting done. And this is why we talk about this work being generational work. Everybody, we all understand ourselves who are sitting in the room now that we're just getting started. This is the work that our children will take on from us and go further. But to have, for instance, Lisa, and there's others out there, but to have folks like Lisa in a seminary who is doing this work means that tomorrow we will have pastors who are in congregations who understand the history of the doctrine of discovery, for instance, and how that has affected theology, how it has affected our worship services, and how has it affected our structure. And slowly this will change, but it'll have a lot to do with folks who are in our colleges, who are in our seminaries, who are helping us understand this in ways we can only imagine today.
Yeah, and that's a great piece that a lot of what I teach, incorporating into disciples' studies and Christian history. I need to start doing some more writing and publishing, and submit some articles to Discipliana and some of the other publications to get out there to start incorporating all of this. Because I talk with my students, a whole lot of this concept of right relations. If you pair right relations with this concept of unity in the Stone Campbell movement, oh my gosh, the connections theologically that can be made there are tremendous for doing ministry together and restoring some of those right relations and bringing about some healing.
I want to thank everybody for hanging in with us. And it's one of the few times that I've seen that the number of people who came on have stayed for a webinar, especially one that went a little longer than we expected. I am so grateful for your questions. I'm very grateful to my spouse, the Reverend Dr. Brian Fell, because he asked one last question and it leads into closing words, which are perfect. He asked if the list of reparations can be posted or sent out somewhere. Mm-hmm. And just so you know, they are on the Center for Indigenous Ministries website, which is centerforindigenousministries.org. So if you go to that website, you will find all of the reparations that were mentioned today. You will find other information. There's resources. We encourage you to go and just explore the website. And as we grow and as we learn, that website will also grow and learn. We are grateful to Crow Eddie and to Lisa and to Dave, and of course, to Rick Lowry for allowing us to be here. It is a beautiful day in Bethany, by the way. Beautiful sunshine. We tried to put the camera where you could see Alexander Campbell's studio and house, but there was too much glare. So instead, behind us, we have the stained glass that came from the windows that were at the Historical Society when it was in Nashville in that building. So a little bit of history with us, and very grateful to Leslie and Linda for being here with us as part of the Center for Indigenous Ministries. We've told you how you can find us. We invite you to reach out, and we ask for your prayers as truth and healing councils come into your region and to maybe into your town where your church is. Reach out and let us know. Thank you so much for being with us.